The Creative Psychotherapist is the official podcast of the Creative Clinicians Corner, a practice-building resource for creative psychotherapists. TCP Podcast is the cast for creative, expressive, and experiential-focused psychotherapists curious to learn how to design, build, and scale a thriving private practice. Your host, Reina Lombardi, interviews successful therapists about the tools and strategies they have used to develop creative-focused practices. They also talk about the products, services, and side hustles they have developed, using their knowledge and creativity to enhance their therapy practices, make a greater impact in their communities, and diversify their income streams. Welcome. Now here's your host, Reina Lombardi.
Hello, welcome. Thank you all for tuning in to this Voices from the Summit special series episode of the Creative Psychotherapist podcast. I am really excited to speak with my next guest, Ericha Scott. She's been on the show before last year, also an Expressive Therapy Summit promotional episode, and welcome back. Thank you so much for making the time to talk to me today.
I'm delighted. I've looked forward to seeing you again.
I'm excited too, and I think that listeners will really value the information that you have to share about our topic today. But before we get into that, just can you share a few things, because your bio is really long, because you've been in the field for a really long time. But just to orient listeners who maybe didn't listen to that episode last year, just a little bit about you, your history, and your work as a therapist.
So I have been in the field for 40 years now. And I began in Texas with a job. I was hired with virtually almost no experience. I had a master's in education, and I was hired to work for a rehab. And I thought, well, I'll try it for a year, see how I like it. Because I love being a fine artist, and I was a fine art photographer. I loved it. But I was looking for something with a little more stability. And at the end of the year, the executive director approached me, and she said, your clients had the lowest relapse rate of any therapist in the hospital. And I had the least experience. And I looked at her and I said, it's the art. Because it was. I mean, there's no other explanation. So I had my clients writing in their journals every day and making art and doing chair work and many psychodrama types of things. But every group had something creative, some creative aspect. I think it really engages people, and it brings the participants closer together. It bonds them. And so they're more likely to help each other after treatment is out.
That's true.
So I was inspired by that. And I did a short stint back in the art world, and then I bounced back in. I was hired by Dr. Renee Fredrickson, who trained Terry Kellogg, John Bradshaw, and Pia Melody. She's one of the top experts in trauma in the world at the time. She'd been working with trauma and sexual abuse, extreme forms of it, for over 15 years. Well, this was 1980. By the time I started working with her, it was 87. My first job was 85. So in 87, she already had 15 years of experience. And so I worked with her for 5.5 years, and it's with her because I knew trauma was a piece, like the really important piece for sobriety and long-term sobriety. And so I worked for her for 5.5 years. And I believe she's the best teacher I ever had. She was amazing. She still teaches, by the way. So
That's amazing.
I know. She, I don't know the last time she taught, but is it Robert Geffner from the International Violence conferences in San Diego? Yeah, she presents for him. She did a great one on stalkers, profiling stalkers.
Ooh.
So she taught me a lot about trauma, how to be present for it, how important it was, how to identify it. I think what's really important is the denial we all have about our trauma and how we try to normalize it or explain it away or rationalize it. I personally believe we have as much denial about trauma as we do about addiction.
Fascinating.
And I think there's a parallel between trauma and addiction and the cognitive defenses. So this is how I make that parallel. I only had one drink. I mean, how many addicts have you heard say things like that? I only used IV once. Well, then you'll hear the sexual abuse survivors say, I was only molested once. It really didn't matter. Or he only touched me on my knee. That's not really important. So the same kind of minimization, rationalization, and it's not conscious. It's important too, I think, for a child because they're protecting their family bond and their family relationships. And while being abused is awful, the threat of not having a roof over your head or a family for many people is terrifying. And
especially in childhood, like we're so dependent on our guardians and the adults in our lives to keep us safe and secure.
And secure and warm and dry and all of that. And that's, so we have our cognitive defenses about trauma, even if the perpetrator didn't threaten us. But then if there are threats to seal the secrets, that drives it home. And most, I don't mean to be flip, but card-carrying pedophiles, those that know they are and are kind of like...
Right, trying to frame it in a different way. Or other than...
They know who they are and they've been deceiving people for a long time. They know children tell their mommy when they have a boo-boo. It's natural for a child to go say, I fell down, I hurt my knee. Children talk. They should talk. They're not supposed to have filters. Maybe grandma's smelly would be better if they didn't say that, but you know what I mean, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
They're supposed to have filters, and that's partly what keeps them safe in a healthy family, is that they don't. So unfortunately, and I worked with pedophiles for a short period of time to help understand their thinking and their ways of being, because I felt I needed to understand that to explain it to my victim clients, because they were trying to understand the sexual, physical abuse from their mindset, their perspective of the world, and it didn't make sense to them. And so, yeah. So I was actually told, don't ever work with this group. Your clients will never forgive you. I said that my intention is to understand it better. And so the reason their threats can be so horrific is they know it has to be a horrible threat to make a point, to get across to a child. You can't tell anyone that we did this. It's not just, sometimes it's as simple as it's our secret and this is fun. But often it's a really scary threat. And generally they have to do something concrete to seal the threat and to seal the secret, because children don't have a lot of life experience.
That's true.
Right? So if you say, I'm going to do this and that and that and this, they're like, well, okay. They don't know. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, so it's understandable that as grown-ups, when people come to therapy, a lot of people don't make the connection between their early childhood trauma, and some, as you know, because of repression and dissociation, don't
Mm-hmm.
even remember it.
Right.
Right.
That's so true.
And I like Frank Putnam's book about how, as infants, we are very variable. We scream one minute, we're laughing the next. And that's normal, almost like a switch between states of being. And it's very quick, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know how babies are. And so as we develop, that smooths out. If we are raised in a loving, healthy family, those extreme mood swings calm down. And the person becomes more integrated over time, unless there's trauma. So that's one way that trauma interferes with our normal ability to integrate over time as we mature. And I like how he explains it. He explains it better than anyone else. It's in his book, The Way We Are.
The Way We Are.
The Way We Are is a brilliant, brilliant book. He works for the National Institute of Mental Health. Now, there's a bit of a controversy. Some people think that's the way that dissociation is created. But I think there are sophisticated perpetrators that actually deliberately cause trauma to create a splitting in the child.
Interesting. Okay, tell me more.
So the idea is creating a part of the self they can control. So, for example, God forbid a father, although this has been around as long as time, would, okay, hold on to your seat, like brace yourself a little bit. Like, God forbid a father would use their own child to make money in any way.
Right.
But if they're going to do that and they have created or split off or helped split off with trauma, a separate part that is only existence is that job.
Wow.
It helps him seal the secret.
That is so fascinating. I've never heard anybody talk about it like this before. But it makes sense. What you're saying makes sense. It's new information to me. Hasn't been put that way.
Not everybody would agree with me. But this is based on having listened and worked with dissociative identity disorder clients since 1987. So I agree with Putnam that is one way dissociation's created. The trauma interferes with a natural tendency to mature and integrate over time.
Mm-hmm.
And then I believe that there's trauma that doesn't just interfere with our ability to integrate, but causes more splitting.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't just interfere with integration and our normal split ways of being. It actually creates a split self.
Yeah.
So I think, so that's the controversy, but I think both are true. And I am not sure, but I think I've seen evidence of both within one client.
Oh, interesting.
Like the different pathways to parts of self. Yeah.
Yeah. For listeners who maybe they're familiar, sometimes we have people that aren't therapists that listen to the show. And so for folks that maybe aren't as familiar with our jargon and dissociation, can you kind of define what dissociation is and how we look at it differently than perhaps we did back in the 80s, when I believe uh, the dissociative identity disorder was more commonly referred to as like split personality
Or multiple
disorder,
personality, multiple
multiple
personality disorder.
personality.
Well, I was fortunate, so I worked with a pretty sophisticated teacher, Reina. So I don't know that my thinking is all that different now. It's more evolved in the understanding of the complexity. But I think the basic foundation of how I understood it back then is not that far removed from how I see it today. The best way I can describe it is I was reading a book about daycare abuse. And it was a journalist that wrote the book, and she was not a clinician. She was not a clinician at all, but she was a very good journalist. And she talked about a little boy who said, when I saw him hurting her, so he was observing abuse by a perpetrator. He said, I was watching from somewhere else and I was crying.
Oh, that's a good description for not being in one's body and being removed and disconnected.
Right. And many people talk about a sense of floating above the bed, or if people don't have a sexual abuse history, I ask about near drowning. It's amazing how many people have had a similar experience to that. And I asked, did you feel like you were floating above? And not everyone, but many people say, yeah. Or in a car wreck. And I call this healthy dissociation, where it seems as if time slows down in a car wreck. It's almost if it gives you a chance to think through your responses better and have a better survivorship in a car wreck, like how to handle the car. But that's a trance phenomenon when time seems to slow down. So some people relate to that sense that time slows during a car wreck. So I had a client that I don't think was dissociative disordered, but he came in one day. He was an adult child of alcoholics. And he said, when I drive to work, I feel as if I cannot see over the steering wheel. So he was regressing height-wise. Like he actually was like a little kid driving to work. And so that actually is behind a lot of my work with body maps, why I use life-size tracings of body maps over and over, because so many people don't have a sense of their true height. So
that is so true. I think too, as our bodies like fluctuate in size, the neural memory that we have, that proprioceptive memory, gets stuck in a different body shape and size. That
happens.
Fascinating.
So while most people use body maps for people that have eating disorders, so they have a sense of their misperception of their body size, I could say horizontally, I use body maps primarily vertically. So with this same person years ago, I said to him, when you were growing up, did your family mark, this is just one of those neophyte questions that ended up opening up so many doors. When your parents if your parents marked your height on the door jamb, and he said they did. I said, did they mark your adult height? He said, no. I said, well, let's do that right now. I was young and energetic. I turned in the door. It was like 20 feet tall. And I went like, oh, I'm not sure it's going to work because of the
height of the door.
But, I was like, oh no, it's not going to work. But I said, well, let's do it anyway. So I marked his height on the door jamb and he stood back. I'll never forget this as long as I live. And he said, I'm really tall. I didn't know. And it was instant empowerment. It's like he filled up. It's almost as if I watched him fill himself up to his full height.
That's fascinating. So he was perceiving himself as much shorter, and that brought him back to the truth of who he was.
An adult man.
Fascinating.
It's instant agency and empowerment. And so he thought he was the height of a wounded child.
Mm-hmm.
Not thought, his perception.
His construct of this experience.
The idea that he couldn't see over the steering wheel on the way to work. You can imagine that, right? So I got so excited. I did it with every client in my practice. I was like, we got to try this. And almost across the board, same response. Wow, I didn't know I was this tall. I was just, hey, wow. So I had one client who had a different response. And it was as meaningful and important, but very different. She was a large woman. She was very tall, very, very tall. And she was a pre and perinatal nurse. And I had been a little concerned about her work with the infants. And we had touched around it a little bit. And she saw her height. She burst into tears. And she said, oh my God, I'm really big. I can hurt people.
Whoa. That's profound.
I still get goosebumps.
I got goosebumps listening. Yeah.
And I have so much admiration for her because she went almost straight to her supervisor and said, I want to be moved to a unit where if I am too rough with the needle or in my nursing care, they can talk about it. They can ask me about it or talk to you about it. I need to be on a different unit. And her supervisor was amazing. It was amazing. So many people who offend, I believe, and I don't think she had offended, I think, but there was a risk, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. I think many people who offend do not perceive themselves
as offenders.
Well, that too, but as tall adults.
Aha. So in your experience, because just to go back, because we've gone a lot in our conversation so far, but you had said you did do some work working with pedophiles because you wanted to understand them. I think that's really important. One, because it's like challenging our own biases that we have about people. And that is really important in our field because usually in my experience is people are coming in for help, but their presenting problem is not what they're there for, right? There's like there's something underlying, some kind of trauma. So in your work with that population, what did you learn about their history that impacted their perception of their behavior?
Right. So Number one, I don't work with that population outpatient in my private practice. I was invited to be a co-facilitator of a group for men and women on probation and parole after being in prison for offending. And it wasn't necessarily only pedophilia. It included other offenses.
Okay.
So I learned a couple of things. And I have to say, this group was fantastic. Like, I was amazed at their holding each other accountable. I was very impressed. I was surprised and impressed. And part of it was my co-facilitator. But, and he, by the way, used plethysmograph, which I've never heard anyone else using really, right? And he would show all kinds of pictures with this measurement about their arousal. And that was partly how they made the determination if they were ready to leave group therapy. Was,
oh, wow.
And you can't fake it, right? So one man was talking about how his victim was young and like 3, 4, or 5. And he said, in kind of a child, not childlike voice, but childlike manner, I kept telling him no. And so I'd already had this sense of distortions in height and how important that is. So I said, would you be okay with standing up and showing us how tall a 4-year-old is against your leg? So we can see the scale between his height and your height. Well, the child maybe barely came above his knee or thigh. And the other men in the group were like, hey, yeah, how come you couldn't say no? I mean it. How come that didn't work when you're more than twice the size of this child? And that was revolutionary for him. That the child was so small compared to him. And there was another man who I challenged because he had been raped in childhood on the playground. And he did literally, so there's that phenomenon of reenactment. If you don't talk about your trauma in therapy or in art or in music or dance, then you're more likely to replicate it for the next generation. Well, so he had done the same thing. But it didn't fit my sense of his kindness and gentleness. I was having a hard time making that. And I said, why? I didn't say it quite like that. It was more like therapeutic. Why? Why, when you know how much pain it caused you?
Right.
Why would you do this to a child? And he sat for a minute and he said, because all the kids laughed at me about the fact I was raped on the playground. They knew it was happening. And they had ridiculed him. And so in his mind, again, I think a distortion in size. They were safer to take it out on than a grown man.
Makes sense.
I think everybody needs to do a body map. It sounds corny. I know it sounds corny, but it's interesting how it changes your perception and in a gentle but powerful way.
How do you facilitate that intervention? I know I use them in my groups when I'm working in substance abuse, because I feel like there's a drive to get out of the body and like not really reflect and attune to what's going on inside. So I use them more to get them to focus on and notice what's happening in the body.
And I do that too. So it does all of that. It's multidimensional, multifactorial. It's so powerful on so many levels. I've used it recently as a tool for somatic experiencing. I help someone with some physiological symptoms that were real, not just psychological pain and distress. And they left with almost no symptoms. We use the body map. So I use it in a myriad of different ways. I use it as a way, especially with dissociative identity disorder, a place for them to show me where their parts live. You can learn so much about where parts are living in the body. It seems as if, my opinion only, not substantiated by any research, that the further the parts are outside of the body, the more dissociated that part is.
Oh, interesting.
So there seems to be a differential between the parts that they perceive living in their body versus those that are floating around.
They can just hop in whenever they want and hop out.
Yeah. And so that then offers a chance to invite them to join the other parts, to meet inside in a safe place in the body, and to welcome them and include them that way. So obviously, as you can imagine, the more dissociated someone is, the more out of touch they are with their emotions, even sometimes their physiological pain, which is dangerous because we need to have our pain to get help when something is wrong. So I have people paint their emotions where they are, color code it. They create their own codes for what the colors mean. I have people paint their physiological pain, their surgeries, their accidents, their, you name it, they paint it. And sometimes we use the same body map over and over and keep building layers. And sometimes we start with the whole new body map. But we photograph the different stages of the body map as it goes. It's really fun. It's like a work of art.
Yeah. And a container, and
all of
it's just all of that, the tangible nature of we're holding all of these things within, but we don't see it. And we live, not all of us, as some people have impaired visual ability, but by and large, the majority of us live through our eyes and what we see. And I think that's what makes, art as a self-reflective process so powerful.
Absolutely. And then remember, imagery and color is a form of cognition.
That's so true.
Right? And because it's a form of cognition, it's one reason. Okay, here we go again on my little riffing about. So ask any kid the logo for Motorola, or one that's too obvious, Apple, or, right? We all know logos, the imagery, right? And so think about the power of imagery. It's like so much information so fast. So we have images inside of ourselves that, when expressed, can provide relief and a release of cognitive distortions we've carried our whole lifetime, and in a way that's gentle and powerful. So did that answer your question?
Yeah. Art is powerful, and I haven't thought about it in that way of like how good of a job it does at working with the cognitive distortions. But it really does.
It does. It makes my job easier because the paper and the art confronts the clients versus me. And think about it. A large portion of the brain is dedicated to operating our eyes.
Yeah.
So why not use as much of the brain as we can while in therapy?
Yes, that makes sense, right? Getting the whole body moving, using our visual skills, using our hearing.
All of that.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, probably from education, that the more of our senses we use to teach, the more likely the student is going to remember what's being taught. Well, the same is true in therapy. And if you have a dissociative client that tends to forget session after session after session, it's hard to build growth when you're not remembering. You don't have a bridge to build on. But if you have art, something visual to document the work you did, it makes therapy go faster.
That is so true. Another piece, I didn't think about that.
I'm amazed because you're so brilliant.
Well, I think you're working in a very different way than I have. I definitely have some experience working with trauma, but not as much working in that area of dissociation, although of course it does come up. But I know before we even got on the live stream today, we were talking about the importance of working with a therapist who really does have a good understanding and training so that they're able to work with what's happening for that client in a way that the client feels safe, doesn't feel judged,
right,
and that you're able to elicit a therapeutic response based on how you're working that therapeutic relationship. What do you think are some things that people aren't necessarily aware of when it comes to working with trauma and dissociation?
I think one of the biggest mistakes, Kevin O'Connor, a past president of ISSTD, said this, but even I, a skilled, like I think I told you before we came on today that I'm not only trained and skilled working with dissociation, but I'm a fellow for the oldest trauma organization in the world, the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. So Kevin said that often the dissociative clients are neglected in treatment because it can be very compliant. And I have an example of this where I had this delightful client who, bright, very well educated, master's or doctorate or something. And when you're working in rehab with substance abuse and trauma, compliant clients are so nice. I mean, it's so great, right? To have a client that's like, yes, ma'am, and that does their work, right? So she was doing all of her assignments. She was doing all of her work. And then she showed me a drawing of herself. And the drawing, she was not, I mean, I was only working with adults. The drawing sort of looked like something you would see from a preteen.
Okay.
Hearts with, wings and, things like that, like flowers. But what really struck me is her, even though she was using I teach blind contour self-portraits, and she had done a blind contour self-portrait, very, very well done. but her eyes were empty. You only had the whites of the eyes. Now, for someone who's deep in trance, sometimes you see that, very rare, but you can see their eyes are rolled all the way up and you can only see the whites of their eyes. You see this also in medieval paintings of mystics, for example,
Right.
that are in deep trance or ecstatic spirituality. So I asked her about it and she said, I can't draw eyes. And I said, you drew all of this other stuff very well. I'm sorry, but I don't believe you that you couldn't draw a little circle for a pupil and an iris. And so she kept protesting. Remember denial. I told, right. We're back to denial. And I said, so what is it that you're missing? I'm not missing anything. I tried that question several different ways. And finally I said, what am I missing?
Ooh.
And she had planned to go visit her perpetrator that was really wanted to kill her. And I was like,
Ooh.
okay. So I was able to change her aftercare plan, keep her safe. That saved her life. And part of it was because of my understanding of dissociation, and that the whites of the eyes with no iris or pupil showing can suggest a high trance.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I go off on these tangents and they don't go anywhere, but oh my gosh, this saved her life.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah, understanding the imagery, just
Mhm.
to check into, right? Okay, I'm not saying that this is definitive, but it is enough that I am curious and I'm going to investigate and do my best to understand what it's about for that individual.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The guy was very dangerous. But we can see this in people. We can see the people that, oh gosh, it's been a while since I've taught this, so I am having a hard time thinking about it, but people that stare up at the ceiling and are not in their body, or numb or frozen. There's a correlation between the freeze state and dissociation. People that are very frozen, people that are, when you inquire about their family history, they're so vague and they can't deliver. I mean, even people who didn't really have trauma will go, yeah, my parents weren't perfect, and they can give you some examples. But people with dissociation and repression have a very hard time giving you a concrete history of their childhood, or it's conflictual, it's confusing. Siblings have different stories. Often I would hear, oh, my sister says this happened, but that didn't happen. Also, the story of their life tells you, like, as we know from adverse childhood experiences, the right?
The ACEs.
Yes. That the more ACEs a child has, the more problems they have in adulthood. So if someone comes to you with 7 or 8 ACEs and they're denying childhood trauma, then it's worth exploring. And I do that in a myriad of ways. Renee was really good about, you go through their childhood with a fine-tooth comb. I love that because you can help sort of tease out through the denial and the minimization. And I think too, just being in therapy, things start to get more clear. Sometimes nightmares are important. Actually, a couple of people come to rehab and they're like, I keep telling them I have these nightmares and they just give me drugs, and then I relapse because of the drugs. It's like, well, let's paint your nightmares. So we paint the nightmares. Inevitably, recurring nightmares, not every single time, but almost every single time, is related to a trauma. This coded in imagery and symbol. And so once you get to that layer of the nightmare through painting or drawing or sculpting, the nightmares stop.
Fascinating.
It's trying to tell you. And so I tell people your nightmares are trying to help you.
Oh, yeah.
And I heard one lecture, I think it was by a Dr. Graves, who talked about with people with DID, they can have different alter ego states, or now I think they're called self states, see the dream from a different perspective. How cool is that?
That is wild. That is really cool.
That's very cool.
I would love to hear you share a little bit about the creative ways that you help people work with those different states, the different self states.
Well, it depends on the client's ability and willingness and openness. So sometimes it takes a while before they're ready. But usually what I try to do is help people understand. So for example, someone comes in and it's like, my addict keeps relapsing. That's actually said by people who aren't DID in rehab, right? And I say, your addict is trying to help you. Let's find out why. What is it that they're seeing that you're not? Let's find out how they see the world. Because they're not trying to hurt you most of the time.
Right.
They're trying to provide some function, whether it's soothing, and maybe they carry the pain of the trauma and they're trying to soothe that pain. I also think alcohol can ground people who are dissociative disordered. So sometimes I think drinking is a way to ground themselves in their body. I've had DID clients talk about, oh, drinking is my superpower. I can drink everyone under the table and I don't even slur my words.
Wow.
That's a dissociative experience.
Yeah.
Not a safe one, by the way.
No, not safe at all.
No. So, because a switch and someone can die or wreck. And so, and you know, I had a client that I was pretty sure, a couple of clients actually, all at the same time. I had a few clients that, because of who referred them to me, they knew each other. They all started wearing have you heard of this t-shirt company or clothing company called Obey?
Oh yeah. It's from the street artist Shepard Fairey. His line, because he like graffitied all over Obey, and like what was the wrestler's name? I forget his name. But famous street artist. It's his stuff.
Look into that more carefully. So I had a slew of clients coming in with that t-shirt all at the same time. I was like, that's odd. Obey. Who are you obeying? It's not me, apparently. Right? So what does that mean? And it ended up being very important to explore what obeying meant.
Mm-hmm. Right. They were deriving something from that, connecting with that piece. Fascinating.
Ah. And in our contemporary world, who do we want our children obeying? And is obeying what we're seeking, or is it self-determination in a healthy way, or
Mm-hmm.
integrated morals and values and
Right.
sense of self-worth?
Mm-hmm.
Who do we want people obeying without question? Because, right.
No, I think disobedience is a positive thing sometimes. It gets a negative rap, but sometimes it's actually a sign that somebody is shifting and growing and evolving, particularly if they felt that they didn't have a voice at some point in their past, to then like start to express it in a way. Maybe it comes out and it's not as, the technique isn't so great, but that act of disobedience is a reinforcer for them, that they're like standing up for their worth and boundaries and their own personal truth.
Absolutely. You're so articulate. So, for example, in some of these cult-like groups, and people aren't questioning because they were raised in an authoritarian, abusive, dominant system where they were taught, you do what I say and you don't give me any lip. Unfortunately, that can be a setup for dissociating some things that need to be looked at later in life. So we've heard those stories of different churches that are extremist, or different political groups that are extremist. Yeah.
Yeah. It's everywhere, unfortunately. But I think it exists on a spectrum, right? Like in some ways, like some are very, very, very rigid adherence to some level of indoctrination, and then others it's maybe not as much, but it's still present, I think, just in like our societal norms and things. It's still there.
Well, there have been a number of sex cults, for example, in LA, Canada, Epstein. Right. So
absolutely. Powerful individuals can potentially do so much harm. Because of that, we always have that choice. We were talking earlier, like what helps people connect with loving others and really embracing that piece of loving each other. We can still set boundaries and have and say no and have healthy, relationships and still be loving and kind.
It's true. And so that is the goal of therapy, is to help people focus on the locus of control. What is my responsibility? What is someone else's responsibility? Where do I draw the line in the sand? Where do I need to be more flexible? How can I sustain long-term relationships in a way that's life-affirming for all of us? And so when you're working with someone who's dissociative disordered, and even if they're not, I like parts work even with people who aren't dissociative disordered, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You're doing the same thing inside of them. You're helping them create relationships and set boundaries and limits, but also reach out across the divide to offer love and support and nurturing. Many people who have a hard time loving themselves because of their child abuse have an easier time loving apart. as a first step to self-love.
That makes a lot of sense too.
Yeah. So that is where the poetry comes in. Remember, we're talking. I keep
yes,
myself.
You're doing your session at the summit in November,
Mm-hmm.
integrating haiku poetry and stream of consciousness writing. Yeah. Let's talk about that.
So it can be done so many different ways, and people will be allowed choices where they can write maybe a part that's struggling, a poem, or they can write a collective poem for maybe the host or the people call it now AMP, the apparently normal part. I don't like that name, by the way. It's like, who says not normal? I don't know. So I like host, and the host tends to be more in denial, and then or the core self. Not everybody believes there's a core self. I do believe that there is a core center self, and so like the parts can write a love letter to the core self, to the host, vice versa. They can write poems to each other. So they can write individual poems, like if there's a conflict, like if there are two parts that are really in conflict, they can write a poem to each other, like one individual part to another individual part. But I also like the group haiku or poetry, and I'll teach haiku, but it doesn't have to be haiku. They can write any kind of poem they want. So, and it's a form of using affirmation, validation, and then bringing in the piece element of nature, which is always part of haiku, which I think anchors it and grounds it and makes it more real. And it's fun. So I generally have people write in stream of consciousness or free association style of writing an event, maybe an event that was a conflict between parts, or maybe a part popped out and said or did something that everybody wished they hadn't. And so they write about that event in detail as fast as they can to bypass their defenses and their inner critic. And then I have them convert that into a poem. It gives them the building blocks or the foundation for how to write a poem. Freud said that, we all know Freud was egotistical, right? I don't think that's like anyone's going to argue with about that. So he said, believe it or not, he said, this is a direct quote, I won't have it perfect, but to the point, he said, the poets discovered the unconscious before he did. And it was through their wading through torturous uncertainties and then kind of making sense of it through poems that they were working with the subconscious, which is true. Yeah. And I agree with him. And so it's a lovely way to access the subconscious. I think a lot of people, whether trauma survivors or newly sober addicts, have a very difficult time with concentration. That is.
Oh yeah. That's right? So hard to focus. You want me to sit here for an hour?
Right. Or you want me to stare at this candle flame and meditate when their mind is pinging all over the place. But if you give them paint or words or poetry to work with, it stills their mind and it calms their body and it helps them develop insight in a way that's very facile. And it makes our job easier if you think about it.
I agree. It does make our job easier. They're putting it all out out there for us. And then it's a matter of us helping them to take that even further now that it's outside of you. How do we utilize that information and keep morphing that into another intervention that's going to be of benefit? And
yeah, thank you. That, I think too, it helps in a gentle manner bypass defenses. So we're brought more material to work with. That's important. It bypasses what's not important and takes us right to the core of what is important.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. You are so delightful. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
I know that, folks can sign up to take your workshop in November at the summit, which is going to be online. It's in via Zoom. It'll be 3 hours on November 7th from 2 to 5 p.m. And we'll put the links in the show notes for that.
Okay. Is that Pacific Standard Time? Because I'll be in Arizona. Do you know what time zone?
Oh, that is a good question.
Okay.
And I apologize.
No.
I didn't write that part down in my little note.
And I forgot, but it will be clear on the website when you register.
Oh, yeah. Definitely clear on the summit website what the time zone specific is. And I'm thinking probably Eastern Standard Time, just based on the time of year. Because the New York summit was always in the fall. And then once Barry started doing them in LA, they were in the spring in LA. So I think it'll probably be Eastern Standard Time. But I also know that you are offering something in your local area in a couple of weeks that goes into this topic a bit deeper. And would you mind sharing a little bit about that in case listeners are in the area in California where you're at, and they might be interested in attending that as well?
So I'm presenting for an intensive outpatient program called Trauma and Beyond. And they have tremendous experience here in LA. And I'm providing an hour-and-a-half lecture about extreme ritualized and organized abuse. And I'm including slides of art by clients from the 1980s and 90s. So it has a historical piece. And we all have heard so much denial about the existence of ritual crime or organized crime, organized abuse of children. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical nature of that in our country. For example, Christopher Columbus wrote back to the Queen of Spain and told her that a 9-year-old or 10-year-old child could be bought for 100, I think it's called castanedos, about the same amount of money it costs to buy an acre of land. So organized abuse has been around in our country since Columbus, and probably before, but Columbus, we have it in writing that it was in one of his letters. So, so I understand denial because it's so horrific. But I will include a little bit about how to identify it and how it shows up and how to be present, even if you think the content validity is in doubt, how to be present. Because a couple of times I processed a memory with a client that I thought, surely this can't be real. And it turned out the trauma was real, but there was an unreal aspect of it facilitated by the perpetrator that made it seem bizarre and
not believable at
right,
first.
exactly.
Yeah.
And yet the client got better from processing it first the way they perceived it.
Mm-hmm.
And then after they healed a little bit, they were able to see through some of the trickery
Mm-hmm.
and get closer to the truth about what really happened.
Yeah.
That makes sense, right?
Definitely makes sense. And I think too, I mean, when we're experiencing a traumatic situation, the way our body is encoding information and the way our brain is encoding information is completely different. And our cognitive process where we like organize information, that is not as strong during those moments because all the oxygen's going into the primal part of like keep me alive, help me survive. And so the way that part of our brain is making sense of the information, it has to prioritize certain pieces. And I think
Absolutely.
those pieces then become like the big part of the memory.
Yeah.
And sometimes it doesn't make sense. It doesn't all go back together right.
Mm-mm. But as you heal the trauma, it teases out and it becomes more clear.
Mm-hmm.
And then the person feels less crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because in some cases, there were things done to make the child doubt their memory.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I think that's common
Mm-hmm.
in trauma
I agree.
for all kinds of people, children and adults too.
Yes.
Gosh, well, there's such like a resurgence over like the term gaslighting. Even it's like you see it over and over, but I think that's why, because it is a powerful tool of getting somebody who isn't feeling very secure in themselves to continue to question their reality. It's like, well, maybe if everybody else is saying all this, I guess I could be wrong.
That happens. A really good book about a type of gaslighting is, I think it's called The Music Box with Jessica Lange in it. Did you ever see that movie?
No, but I love her.
In the movie, her father, unbeknownst to her, apparently had been a Nazi war criminal. And she was a lawyer defending him. And then, I hate to give away the plot, but I kind of have to make my point. She went actually to Germany and found evidence that he was a war criminal and came back to talk to him about it. And she presented it to him, and this jovial, loving father looked at her and said, "You need help."
Ooh.
And I've heard scenarios like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a brilliant gaslighting move. You need help.
Mm.
So
Completely disempowering.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What you're saying can't be true. It's not true. You're making it up. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah. I think it's so important, like in the work that we do, to believe our clients and, really believe what they're sharing, even in those moments where we go, I don't know.
initially, I think that's absolutely true.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And then after processing's happening, begin to help them tease out the part that's
Mm-hmm.
true and look at the cognitive distortions and the trickery and the deception. Because the goal is to help people see life as it is. So that I tell people, if you see your parents or your caretakers with rosy colored glasses, when it's your turn to mate, guess what you're going to be wearing? Which would be fine if the person happens to be a really good person.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't work so well if they're not.
Right.
And so, and you can love your parents no matter what. My mother was a awful parent, and I confronted her, and we talked about it, and we talked about it. And finally, one day, she looked at me and she said, my mom was quite a character, Southern debutante, alcoholic. She looked at me and she said, that was done to me and I did it to you. And I'm sorry. I never expected an apology. I didn't think it was in her makeup. I didn't think it was capable. I didn't think she was capable of it.
Mm-hmm.
And she made an amends even a few years later, another one. She looked at me, she said, I really hurt you, didn't I? And all I said is, yeah, you did.
Mm-hmm.
She said, I'm sorry. She was a quadriplegic by that time.
Wow.
From her drinking.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's such a gift to have that acknowledgement and apology. And it's also often so rare.
Rare.
Right? That a lot of people don't get that, but it could be something that we can facilitate in
Absolutely.
the work that we do to have a healing impact.
I've seen it happen more often than I ever expect in my office. And part of it was my willingness to be in her life and to set limits and to refuse to cave and blow off her denial and her and not be cruel about it, but be firm.
Yeah.
And to be dogged about it.
I think earlier we were talking about that ability to love. You know, we can love somebody and we can still hold those boundaries. And that's important that we learn how to do that, especially when our parents aren't well. So I know we've been talking a while. I could talk to you forever. I feel like you have such interesting stories about the work that you've done and the impacts that you've made. For folks that are listening that want to learn more about you and how you work, because you work only providing intensive services these days. You're not doing weekly therapy. Can you share a little bit about how those intensives work?
So first of all, intensives have been my favorite thing to do for decades. Because someone can come in, even if, and I actually like it when people are in therapy. I want them to have a therapist, especially if they fly in from the East Coast or another state. And we all have moments where we get stuck, even in good therapy. It's not even an indictment about the therapist. We all get stuck. We all need to try different things. Art therapy is a brilliant way to get through blocks, I think. And so people get referred to me and we talk about if their goals are realistic, and they come to Malibu. Sometimes they have friends they can stay with in LA or Malibu. Sometimes they get a bed and breakfast. And we decide how much time we think they need. So far it's been 2 to 5 days. And it's half days. It's only 4 hours.
Okay.
That's enough. Believe me. It's pretty
that
intense.
Is.
It's enough. Because I think the psyche can only assimilate so much at a time. And I like at minimum of 2 days, although I will accept someone for 1 day. I like 2 days because people tend to have very important dreams after their first day.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And then we had that to weave in the next day, which is really fun. And people come in for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they're involved in a sexually addicted relationship and they can't break free. Sometimes a friend died that was really beloved and close and they can't stop crying. Sometimes people come in because they're stuck in their career or in a relationship with a family member. Chronic relapsing is a common reason people come in. And in my mind, that's almost always a trauma that's been unhealed. People come in for eating disorders that have, like, as you know, sometimes when people get sober from one compulsive behavior or one substance, then the secondary raises its head, says, oh, I want my time now. And so people come in for the secondary addiction has popped up. So people come in for a myriad of reasons and sometimes more than one reason, and that's all good. It's grist for the mill. People have come in because they knew they had trauma and have never, even though they've been in therapy for a long time, have never been able to talk about it. So we start with painting it first, which is a wonderful way to bypass the fear of talking about trauma.
Yeah.
So it's a combination of art, getting a good history, finding out what their primary goals are. One time, also more than I've done this many times, but we do sometimes spiritual work depending on their religious background and belief system. By the way, about 50% of Christians believe in reincarnation. So, you have some flexibility depending on that person's orientation, and I work with them whatever they bring. So somewhere a long time ago, I learned about helping someone walk a loved one to the light who's passed away. And more than once, I felt the grieving person was grieving not only their own grief, but the grief of the person who died, if they're really connected to them. Like, especially a person who dies suddenly. I know this sounds so woo-woo, but it just feels like they're grieving for two people, not just themselves. And so I'll facilitate, whether it is a fantasy or not, I help them imagine lovingly walking their loved one to the light, where they will be safe and held and accepted and forgiven and blessed and taken care of. And the grief is gone almost. It's deeply moving, and I cry every time because it's just so beautiful and beyond.
Yeah.
I don't know, have words for it. So I think art is a gateway to the self. It's a gateway to the subconscious. It's a gateway to our cognition. It's a way to bypass our defenses and our denial. I also think it's a gateway to God or higher power or spirit or other realms of consciousness. And so the gate that you choose to go through is a choice.
Yeah. Beautiful. And I love that. That's such a great place for us to end our conversation tonight. And I agree with all of those things, and it's why we're art therapists, for sure. And it's always such a pleasure speaking to you. And I hope that your session in November at the summit is very well attended. And listeners, if you've never been to the summit before, highly recommend checking them out. They
They're amazing.
always have amazing presenters and really cool. I've learned just some of the coolest interventions there over the years, and it's just a high quality continuing education experience. And I'm sure if folks take that session with you, Ericha, they're going to be doing some really fun poems and stream of consciousness writing that then they can take out into their work that they do with clients.
Right.
And we'll put all that information in the show notes. So if you're listening, check back and I'll have the direct link, but the summit website is just expressivetherapysummit.com. But
let's say my phone number and my website, I think.
Yes. If people want to find you, what is your website? Because it's not your name.
It is, but I can't remember exactly if it has PH. I'm not sure all the credentials I have on it or not, but it's the easy way to remember it is Art Speaks Out Loud. So it's www.artspeaksoutloud, but it ends in .org. So artspeaksoutloud.org. And then my phone number is 310-880-9761.
310-880-9761.
And I'm always available to talk about whether an intensive might be a
good fit for somebody.
Yeah.
Ash, do you offer professional consultations for other people that are working with this population? I just think that you would be such an amazing resource for like folks that are just starting out in the work and trying to find their way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if we got enough people, we could do a group, which would make it more reasonable. I'd be delighted. Yeah. I love it. I love teaching about it. And I think you make me a better speaker because you're so talented. You're so good. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm just hanging on all of the nuggets of wisdom that you're sharing. So make it easy.
Thank you.
Well, listeners, it's been a pleasure. I'm going to roll our outro and we'll talk to you later. All the information will be in the show notes, so check it out. And thank you so much again, Ericha. I really appreciate you.
I appreciate being here. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Creative Psychotherapist. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For show notes, downloads, and additional resources, head over to the website at www.creativeclinicianscorner.com.
And